Hey, good afternoon, church. I haven't done a Monday's Thought on Sunday sermon in a while, but there's a really profound and important statement that Jesus makes, using two examples in the verses that follow our passage from Sunday that I want to just briefly look at because they're part of this conversation that Jesus had with these followers of John the Baptist. If you remember from the sermon in Matthew 9, verses 14 and 15, Jesus is telling some of John the Baptist followers why his disciples don't fast. He basically says that they don't need to fast in order to come into the presence of God because he's right there with them. But then he goes on to say that there will come a time when he's gone and followers of Christ will need to fast. But I want to look at verses 16 and 17 because they represent a very important and religion shaking theology from Jesus. Jesus is explaining to his questioners a much bigger implication of the Son of God coming to earth than just fasting requirements. Jesus says, starting in verse 16, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Now, these two illustrations are hard for us to understand because, well, we don't live in the first century. But understanding these references is critical to understand just what all Jesus accomplished. Notice that Jesus is comparing two different things, old and new. New or unshrunk cloth on an old garment, new wine into old wineskins. Jesus is using this analogy to tell his Jewish listeners and us that things have changed because of his presence here on earth. Things are different. The old way of doing things will no longer work because there's now something new. See, when you wash a garment several times, especially the material from Jesus' time, it has a tendency to shrink. And if you get a hole in that already shrunk garment, and then you try to sew a piece of cloth into it, as soon as you repair that or wash that repaired garment, that new cloth is going to shrink and it's going to tear that hole open even more. If you can imagine, you've got an old garment, it's already shrunk, it's got a hole in it, and so you take a 2x2 patch of a new cloth and you sew it into that old garment, and then you wash the whole thing. Well, that 2x2 patch will shrink down to 1x1 or whatever, but it's going to shrink. And as it does, it's going to tear the stitching all around where you sewed it in, and it's going to pull some of that cloth around it, making the tear even worse. And old wineskins have already dried up. They've shrunk down. They've lost their elasticity. Old wineskins are stiff, but new wine is still fermenting. It's still in the process of fermenting, and in that process, it's giving off gases. So if you put that new wine into an old wineskin that's already stiff, those gases, as they're being given off, is going to be trying to expand that wineskin, but it can't. It's old. There's no expansion left in it. And so what happens is as it tries, it's eventually just going to burst, ruining not only the old wineskin, but the new wine. So what Jesus is saying, and here's what's so important, is that the old religious ways of the Jews will no longer work. There's a new system in place where righteousness is no longer granted just because you're a Jew and keep the laws, like fasting twice a week. No, if you try keeping that old way, you're just going to come to ruin. You'll be a new cloth on old garment. You'll be new wine in an old wineskin. Because now that Jesus is here, it's belief in him that redeems you with God. See, this is a very clear statement about how Jesus has initiated a new covenant with Israel and the rest of the world. Jesus coming to earth has both fulfilled the new covenant with Abraham or fulfilled the old covenant with Abraham and Moses, and it's created a new covenant where anyone who has faith in the name of Jesus will be saved. So this new covenant that Jesus is explaining is truly a fundamental change to the old ways of the Jewish religion and the new ways of those who will follow Christ. It's both a fulfillment and a new promise. Both of those represented in Jesus. And that's a big statement from two rather difficult to understand illustrations. And I think that's just pretty cool. I hope you think it's good stuff as well. Hit me up if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you. God bless.